next week or sometime during the week, you'll notice that there aren't trick questions. I'm really just trying to test your command of the content of the class. And there'll be a little bit more choice than is indicated here, but the structure will be basically the same. Some short questions for which you give short answers, and then some short essays. And really, the two areas that are being covered in the exam is dynamic capabilities and profiting from innovation. They're the core framework, in one case a framework, dynamic capabilities, and model, which is profiting from innovation. You know, there's a lot of reading, I know, but if you get command of the literature around profiting from innovation, which you're hearing about today, and you've heard about on previous classes too, and dynamic capabilities, you'll be in good shape. Now, I'm also available for one-on-one or group meetings. Ian is happy to arrange those. I do actually have office hours posted, although no one has approached me, but I will make myself available by appointment, and I'm pretty flexible as to times. Evenings are generally better, but I'm flexible. So start looking at these exam questions, and I'm sure that you'll get familiar with that material in short order.
Actually, Professor Teece, let me mention a couple of operational items from the midterm. So, as just noted, office hours by appointment can be in addition to the ones that have been posted and that you have responded to over the weekend. So those are the ones that are the individual next Wednesday afternoon and the group next Wednesday afternoon, and the two in March. So if you're interested in office hours one-on-one with Professor Teece, then you can arrange that as well. Just email me directly, preferably not in B courses, but directly to my email, so I can bring in the scheduling. On my side, also for the midterm, you can check the test taking parameters with HonorLock in B courses. If you go into quizzes, you can take the practice quiz, and it actually is a pretty seamless process. You don't have to actually interact with the proctor. It's all automated. You go in and present your face and your room setup on Zoom, on HonorLock, that is, and it's quite quick to get set up. We have waived the photo ID requirement, so there is no need to bring a driver's license, passport, Cal ID, or any other form of photo ID. We have not enabled the ability to have blank note-taking paper, and that would probably be just one more thing for the system to check, which might slow down the process. And likely people will not require that. If you do, however, have a preference for being able to take notes during the exam, again, it's not open note, but basically jotting down answers by hand, then let me know and we can enable that. But unless I hear from anyone, the ability to jot down handwritten notes as you're taking the exam outside of the HonorLock module will not be enabled, just to make things simpler. And I think that is it. And again, I really recommend checking the HonorLock practice quiz to make sure that you have the Chrome extension enabled and that your system is set up. The exam will be released next Wednesday evening around 6 o'clock in the evening next Wednesday, and will be available until midday the following Monday. So anytime 24/7 within that period, you can log in to HonorLock through B courses and sit for the exam for 2 hours. And again, you don't need to be in a completely silent place, but you are being monitored. And basically, if the remote proctor notices anything, then the test can be paused and that situation is checked. So it is a remote monitoring setup, but again, from a user experience, pretty seamless and administratively quick. If you have any questions, let me know, but I think that should cover all of the items. And by next Wednesday, thank you, I do mean the 24th. Yes, so released the 24th and must be completed by whatever the following Monday is, which, if we've got this right, oh no, and so we've actually, it can be done through Tuesday before the class. So from evening of Wednesday the 24th through late morning Tuesday, March 2nd. I think that's it.
Well, thank you for that, Ian.
Yeah.
Let me also say that I appreciated the answers to various discussion questions, where we put forward that FT piece about Jeff Bezos, and a number of you had provocative comments, and one pointed out that, well, if you're looking at Enron Corporation way back when, you might have thought Enron was great too, but it was built on accounting shenanigans of one kind or another. I'm pretty sure that's not the case with Amazon, but nonetheless, the greatness is measured by not just profitability, but by how the various relevant stakeholders are treated and how they benefit. And if a company, of course, does great for a long period of time, it has to be what I call it. It has to meet criteria of evolutionary fitness, which means it's got to be taking its stakeholders into account, or they'll come up to bite them. I suspect that Amazon now is going to have a huge set of antitrust issues, as did Microsoft, and the Digital Markets Act in the EU will seriously impair what they're doing. And so there's a difficult period for Amazon ahead of it now. And maybe that's another reason why Bezos is stepping to one side, because it's not going to be as much fun for the next decade as it was for the last. Anyway, I may put some comments back in writing to various of you, various members of the class who provided good answers and good responses. But I'd like to now move on. Ian, can we go back to where we were?
You have the slides.
Oh, I do. Okay. What happened to, how do I get back to where I was? Can you remember where we were? Yeah. Okay. Get IP smart. Right. So here is, if you really want to take something and put under your pillow, this is it for the Profiting from Innovation framework. This tells you the business model to select, and the activities to integrate into or to do internally, and the activities that you can outsource, and give you a better chance of succeeding. And this framework is the weakness is that it begins with an innovation. It says, well, not its weakness, but what it's trying to answer is not how to innovate. It's not asking the question, how do you innovate? It's asking a question which too few people ask. Okay, let's assume you're good at creating value. Let's assume that you know how to innovate. Do you know how to commercialize innovation in a way that's sustainable? And by sustainable, I mean that it can earn enough so that you can afford to invest in the next innovation. So it's about how you continue to innovate, and how you garner the resources that are needed and enable the innovation process to continue. So there's a huge simplification here, which is it's assuming an innovation is just asking the secondary question, which is, all right, how do I commercialize it? And that's the essence of the profiting from innovation framework. Are there any questions that you want to put beyond what you already have with respect to that before we move on? We're going to move on a little bit and discuss, we'll go back to dynamic capabilities, quite frankly, but I want to see if there's questions on your mind before we do so. I do have to remark, while you're thinking about questions, is that I do like Thornhill's assessment that Musk is really a standout in the boldness in which he has moved, not just in one company, but in two, to be a simultaneous entrepreneur with Tesla and SpaceX at the same time is really quite remarkable. And quickly competing not just with other companies, but with nation states in terms of what he's doing in deep space is quite remarkable. And it really speaks to the fact that there are huge possibilities and opportunities always out there. I mean, that could have been addressed, but it takes people with exceptional vision and exceptional courage and exceptional resources, which, as you know, in Musk's case, it was his early investment in PayPal and his involvement in PayPal that generated the resources to enable him to do Tesla and SpaceX at the same time. So really quite remarkable story. Okay, so I don't see any questions popping up, Ian. So let's move on to discuss this FT opinion piece a little bit. And, leadership matters. I mean, these companies didn't just happen. There are personalities and people behind them. In the case of Microsoft, of course, it was Gates in particular. With Amazon, it was Bezos in particular, and with Tesla, it's Musk. But in the case of Microsoft, you see that Steve Ballmer, for some reason, managed to stick in there for 10 years and produce nothing in the way of market value gains. That would be forgivable if you could come up with a bunch of other benefits to society that he created. But, I must say, I thought the guy was a buffoon, and I couldn't understand why Gates would let him be in there. Gates is a brilliant guy, but I guess I didn't understand something about him. But his successor, of course, has shown that there was always a different Microsofts sitting out there, and maybe Ballmer actually did get Microsoft into the cloud. I don't know whether or not he initiated that process or not, but there are successes here that are really quite remarkable, and the individual CEO has got something to do with that. Nadella, I think for me, has been remarkable in terms of his ability to transform a company that was really stuck. Ballmer, wasted billions of shareholders' money buying Nokia, was it Nokia or whoever it was? Yes, Nokia's phone business, and that was an abject failure. Tim Cook, of course, has done he's been on top of Apple during a period of great, considerable financial success, but in terms of innovation out of Apple, well, not so clear. We've seen much in the last 10 to 15 years. So, increase in market value and innovation are not necessarily closely correlated. But I think the interpretation here is that the Jobs and others left a pretty good foundation that Cook could continue to build and continue to develop, and that explains to some extent its success. Very, very good at execution. In the dynamic capabilities framework, it's not the sensing and sense-making part that you would give to Tim Cook, it's the seizing. And Apple really hasn't had to transform dramatically. It's had to manage bigness, but it hadn't had to transform. So Tim Cook is to me, not proven yet that he's got a full portfolio of dynamic capabilities under his belt. If Apple strikes a downdraft, we'll get to see how Tim Cook turns out as a manager. So what I thought I would do now is, actually, I've invited you all to join this webinar on Thursday, where I'm on a panel with Kathy Eisenhart, who's a professor at the Stanford. She's not in the Stanford Business School. She has a PhD from the Stanford Business School, but she is actually in the engineering school. Stanford has two business schools. The better one is in the engineering school. The GSB mints the MBAs, but quite frankly, when I look at faculty research, I don't really see anything of any interest coming out of it. But the engineering school is very dynamic. But I don't see necessarily quite eye to eye with Kathy Eisenhart either. But I've been given this topic, and I'll share it with you because I didn't really know much about Kathy's work, but it relates to dynamic capabilities. And the topic of this webinar is dynamic simplicity. And given the introduction you've already had to the nature of the knowledge economy with deep uncertainty and great complexity, you're probably as troubled by this title as I am, because there's, in my view, very little about dynamic competition that's simple. That said, Kathy Eisenhart has laid out a framework and reminded us there's certain simple rules that are necessary for companies to be successful in complex environments. So what I'm going to do is sort of briefly outline her thesis and show how it relates to dynamic capabilities. So this is what David Teece is going to say on Thursday if you show. It's not required that you show for this, and you're getting a preview of it here, so there's no real need for you unless you actually want to hear Kathy, which I would strongly recommend. She's one of the top management of technology thought leaders and professors in the world, and very, very good from an organizational perspective, and has done a lot of field research. So she's somebody you should really pay attention to. Now, my thesis, and you've heard this thesis developed in this class here, is that the real world business environment today is very much characterized by VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that this is not something you can escape. So there's a lot of complexity out there. And, this notion of dynamic simplicity says that somehow or other there's a lane that you can run in this complex world that's actually quite simple. And you can get yourself out of the complexity trap. But my view is that managers can't generally escape this except by accepting government regulation. If you want to get certainty into your business, then one way is to prevent the entry of competitors and to have a heavily regulated industry, because very few new entrants come into a regulated industry, and there's very little competition in regulated industries. But the problem then is that you don't suffer uncertainty because of competition, but you suffer uncertainty because of the political environment. So it's just substituting marketplace uncertainty with political uncertainty. So you really haven't gotten anywhere. So it's hard for me to understand how you can end run complexity. But Kathy puts forward the thesis that, and I actually agree to a limited degree, that dynamic environments, if you've got simple rules for operating the company and simple rules for management, they can help, but they're not a panacea. And as already presented in this class, dynamic capabilities require reasoning from first principle, especially with respect to sensing and sense making, and also with respect to strategy. So if you've got to reason from first principles, there's no simple rule book, there's no simple textbook. It's not like there's a cookbook you can go to. So cookbooks are a way to simplify cooking. I don't know of a cookbook to simplify management in a highly complex environment, but notwithstanding that, Kathy Eisenhart believes that there are simple rules. So what does she mean when she says that companies can operate by simple rules? What she means is that there's a certain number of guidelines for decision making. Those guidelines can vary from company to company. Your guideline can be choose projects based on NPV. That's a guideline. Or your guideline can be don't pay attention to NPV. That's another guideline. Simple rules can be context specific. So it can be, if you're dealing in industry or product market A, use NPV, or if you're in product market B, then don't use NPV, but use payback period or whatever. Her simple rules are not overly prescriptive, but nevertheless provide guidelines. And they're close to what I think of as standard operating procedures, or at least one can say that if you have standard operating procedures, this is the way you do business here, then that's a simple rule. I'm obviously giving a very, very terse and truncated view of what she means by simple rules, but that's the general idea. They break down into three areas: boundary rules, which is how, what investments are acceptable, how diversified can I be? Do I have to stick to my knitting or not? If I'm in this swim lane, can I cross into a different swim lane? What are the things that I'm willing to businesses I'm willing to go into? What are the services I'm willing to provide? And what are the services I'm not willing to provide? And so boundary rules are not just about what you say yes to, it's also about what you say no to. Prioritizing rules are, what really matters in the organization. Is profitability going to always be your priority? Is it going to be revenue? Is it going to be employee satisfaction? Is it going to be customer satisfaction? Obviously, in the case of Bezos, there was a simple rule, which is the customer comes first. The customer is king and will always be king, and to hell with competitors. So you can see that there are some simple rules that have been used by great companies in highly complex environment. And then there are stopping rules. When's enough of when do you say no? Or when do you stop investing? And when do you when do you stop selling a product? When do you move into a new product? There are these three categories, according to her, and she's probably right. There are reasonable categories. The more I thought about this notion that you can run a company by simple rules, I started to warm up to it, because I know that we're all capable, and particularly large organizations are capable of actually creating complexity. And by that I mean companies can actually, particularly top management, can impose all kinds of reporting requirements and put all kinds of limits on decision making. That getting anything done is incredibly complex. Trying to get something done in the University of California, Berkeley, it crosses departments and crosses, campuses. You would think if we're all University of California that we could easily cooperate. And in fact, we can in many areas, but in certain areas we can't. So organizations create rules, and that creates complexity. So large organizations in particular create too many rules, and complexity flows from that. So when I thought more about that, I said, well, yes, and I can understand why simple rules can work, because bureaucracies tend to create lots of complex rules, too many of them, and they're too complex. So I started to warm up to this notion that simple rules are beneficial. And I've seen it, and you've all seen it, where executives at the top start imposing lots of reporting requirements on other people, and all kinds of thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that. And simplification is virtuous if you have that kind of environment to work within. And I would say too few rules are often better than too many. And this is really a hard act for companies, because there's all kinds of regulation and compliance that companies must satisfy as well. And so in a world of regulation, obviously there's a certain number of rules that you really have to stick to, but hopefully not too many. So the benefit of simple rules is that they avoid analysis paralysis, and they do enable faster execution. So if you can simplify, and this is true of just about everything in life. In fact, let's go back to the beginning of my slide here. Look at the quote from Einstein up top: everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's advice from a genius. Which reflects the fact that there's a certain irreducible amount of complexity, but you can certainly get rid of the man-made complexity. The irreducible complexity in a complex problem is something you have to live with, but the complexity you create yourself is not something you need to live with. So I've actually become quite in tune with this aspect of simple rules. Managers can reduce their own self-generated complexity, and if they distill that into standard operating procedures, that can also assist efficiency. But is this the same thing as dynamic capabilities? This is, I think, where if you listen to the webinar, there's going to be a little bit of a debate between me and my colleague, Kathy Eisenhart, because she thinks that simple rules are a handmaiden of dynamic capabilities. And I think that's only true to a very limited degree. And let me explain the degree to which I think it's relevant. And I'll begin that by thinking about creativity. Those of you that have studied creativity, I think will recognize that to be creative and to be inventive, yes, I suppose there are some simple rules, which is work hard, free your mind up for open thinking, engage with others, but there's no formula, there's no simple rule that I can teach you from a book about how to be creative. In fact, if you don't learn to take the rules apart, you get trapped with the way the world is. In fact, the reason why there is not much creativity is that people think there's just one way to do things, that they think that there are rules about, if you're designing an automobile engine, and should the cylinders be aligned or should they be in a V shape? Well, until someone came up with the V, the V8, and the V6, and the V12, everything was in a straight line. That was the design rule. So design rules become habits of mind as well. So rules need to be broken, in fact, for creativity to flourish. I think we all know that. Rules need to be broken for creativity to flourish. And the last bullet point here is, as my colleague Charlotte Namath here in the psych department at Berkeley has a great book on, I think it's called In Defense of Troublemakers. Troublemakers in organizations are often very creative people. I mean, there's two types of troublemakers. There's ones that throw sand in the gears, but there's others that are always pushing against the rules and looking for new and better ways to do things. And that's always trouble to some people because it's disturbing their even and predictable ways of doing things. So where do I come down on this? I come down on this by saying that whenever there are simple rules, there's an underlying conceptual model. And that may be useful, but you have to constantly be changing rules. If you're not changing rules, you're not changing your underlying conceptual model. If you're not changing your underlying conceptual model, you're probably not innovating. I understand the general desire to make something simpler because simpler is also more elegant. But simple rules are not only more elegant, but they do economize on what I call bounded rationality. What I may mean by that, you don't have to spend your time analyzing things and looking at things from every different angle if there's a simple rule. You can just apply the rule and move on. But of course, that's the Achilles heel of an organization. If you've got simple rules, how do you know that the right rules? Yes, they simplify organizational life, but they also stand in the way of progress. So I've come to a view that simple rules work for managing some types of uncertainty, but not others. And remember, we talked about the business environment and the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty about prices, about competitive strategies, about political interventions in the market. I'll call that structural uncertainty. And I'm following here the Nobel laureate Charlie Koopmans, who won the Nobel Prize, I think, in the late 60s, mid 70s. He made this distinction between behavioral uncertainty and structural. Behavioral is when uncertainty is caused by people, and structural is when it's more caused by institutions and the basic structure of the economy or the environment. Now, these distinctions, of course, are not all that crisp, but the general point here is that behavioral uncertainty is very much made by people, and simple rules can help you get out of your own way. So that's my, highly shortened version of simple rules. If you can avoid your own self and the complexity that managements or previous management teams create, then you have a better chance of running the organization better. Now, how does this relate to dynamic capabilities? Well, remember, we talked about the distinction between ordinary capabilities and dynamic capabilities. And ordinary capabilities are about, running the business. And indeed, that's when rules work. If you are just running an operation, having a set of rules will assist. Efficiency is about following, a set of rules and getting predictability. If I can make something predictable, then I can start taking the cost out of it. So ordinary capabilities are ones that are more easily supported by simple rules. But then we go to dynamic capabilities. I'm not sure I can think of simple rules that define dynamic capabilities. Because if you're trying to get to Mars, if you're Elon Musk trying to figure out how to get to Mars, what's the simple rule that'll get you to Mars? I don't think there is one. Now, there's something in the middle, and this is a new term for you and for me alike, called low-level capabilities or low-level dynamic capabilities, which are things that companies need to do in order to change, such as R&D and M&A and so forth. And maybe there's some room for rules with respect to those activities. But thinking about the big type of investment decisions, with Bezos deciding whether to do AWS, who's Steve Jobs deciding whether to do the iPod and the iPad? Are there simple rules? Well, if there were, the life of the MBA at Haas would be a lot easier, and my life would be a lot easier. So we'll have to see. So let's come back to what dynamic capabilities are. This is, we define dynamic capabilities as the ability of an organization and its management to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competences to address rapidly changing environments. Well, what's the simple rules for doing that? I don't know. So let's break it down. Sensing. Are there simple rules for sensing and sense making? Are there simple rules for seizing, for investment, or for execution? Are there simple rules for transforming? So let me just pause there and ask you for your viewpoints. Here we have a distinguished professor at Stanford saying that the way to manage when there's deep uncertainty is to figure out simple rules. That's the role of top management. Get the whole organization to understand these rules and put the organization on automatic pilot. So here you have two leading professors at two leading business schools, both here on the edge of Silicon Valley, or in one case in the middle of Silicon Valley and the other on the edge. Is there any daylight between the simple rules perspective and dynamic capabilities? Are they one and the same, or where are we? I'd love a question or two. I'd sooner take them now rather than the webinar on Thursday when I'm using you here as my training wheels to get this sorted out, because it's a very important set of questions. Let's just pause for a minute and see if we have anybody with a brilliant idea. Rules keep the firm aligned through transformation, but you also need flexibility to change. Yeah. So yes, you do need some rules, but you need flexibility to change, which means you also have to figure out when and how to change the rules. Now, I think Kathy Eisenhart would say yes, but unless you can tell me when and how I've got to change the rules, am I really providing a useful guideline for CEOs? So let's put the question this way: if rules, let's say we agree that there's some values in rules, so long as they're the right rules, but that you have to be willing to change the rules when the circumstances and the environment changes. What are the indicators? What are the signals, if you will, that come in from the environment or from inside the organization that tell you, listen, we should change the rules because the game is different? And remember, the very first day of class, we talked about mixed martial arts, where there's very few rules in engagement. It's not like chess where there are rules. There aren't rules of competition. Well, yes, of course, there's antitrust that sort of puts guardrails around, but it doesn't tell you what you have to do inside the guardrails. There are not clear rules of competition. So how do we know when we need to change?
David, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Professor, I think, like most people, like most people here who took leading people last year, one critical thing we learned is that, in times of deep uncertainty, one of the most important things you can do as CEO is have a clear, consistent message. So, what I heard what I kind of heard from what you were saying about these simple rules is, it's more set up, to keep the organization going, keep decision making, somewhat, um, aligned through these times of deep uncertainty. But I think to your points, it doesn't allow your firm to flex in a way to take advantage of the uncertainty that might be happening. Um, but it's almost just a way to, yeah, keep the organization going, right, and keep on that clear, consistent message and keep clear, consistent decision making going in times of deep uncertainty.
Um, Good observation. So, with COVID, clear and consistent messaging, I think, is where you started. But so the rule is clear and consistent messaging. It doesn't tell you what the content of the messaging should be.
Right.
It should be clear and consistent. But messaging should always be clear and consistent, shouldn't it? I mean, are there circumstances where messaging shouldn't be clear and consistent? I guess it's making sure that you are always, you're not creating confusion, I suppose, another way to think about it. Yeah, because I mean, the opposite of rules to some people is chaos. On the other hand, maybe we have to learn to manage under chaos because that is the world. And if we try to put rules and tame the beast, so to speak, um, yeah, we can't tame the beast. But in thinking that we're going to tame the beast, we fool ourselves into thinking that we can escape from uncertainty. Uh, so this quickly becomes a philosophical discussion, but I really appreciate your insight and your willingness to jump in with that observation. And I do, don't get me wrong, I do think that there are some macro level rules, but they are so, like always be ethically, always treat employees well, always be ethical. Clearly there are some simple rules, but are there simple rules for strategy? Are there simple rules for investment? Um, Kathy would claim that yes, there are simple rules for strategy. I don't know what they are, but she claimed, well, it's a matter of figuring out how to create and capture value. But we just went through the profiting from innovation exercise, right? And I probably threw 20 or 30 different observations and concepts at you. And you're probably going to tell me there's no simple rule other than, well, one simple rule is get strong IP protection if it's available. Okay, there's one simple rule. Another simple rule is make sure the executives and the lawyers actually work together around IP. Another simple rule is understand complementary assets. Another simple rule would be when complementary assets are not in competitive supply, you're disadvantaged. That's not so much a simple rule as it is an observation. The simple rule would be if in doubt, contract out. If in doubt, contract out. So, yes, well, Kathy actually claims that she's not invented this, but she surveyed a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, and the way they do survive is by having simple rules. That's how they navigate through this complexity. And I think when it comes to lower level dynamic capabilities, that's true. But I don't think that Elon Musk has got a simple rule of how to get to Mars with SpaceX. Although you can dig deeper and say there are some simple rules, which is don't buy from the defense contractors because they've been on cost plus contracts and they're not going to be good business partners. That's a simple rule. Help me out here, class. I've been thrown to the wolves on Thursday, and I need a little help.
Hi, if I may, Professor.
Yes.
This is Jeff Hyatt. One of the theses that I close is the idea of the unbundled corporation, originally
Mm-hmm.
forwarded by the partners at McKinsey 20 years ago. And economies of scale versus economies of scope versus true innovation. I would argue rules are in service to scale and efficiency, and frankly, innovation. And I admit my bias is towards a design thinking based view of innovation, is this sense that it's questioning those rules and questioning those orthodoxies that actually creates the new opportunities. So I am, in a sense, maybe because I'm a rule breaker, but I feel as though they're sort of diametrically opposed. What's your opinion?
Well, you just said exactly what I'm implicitly saying here, Jeff. I mean, you said it more elegantly than I did. That yeah, innovation is about busting the rules. It's about essentially, you know, in one sense, you're a soft troublemaker. The Elon Musk is not a rule-driven person. Steve Jobs is not a rule-driven person. Nor do they create too many rules for other people, for that matter. And Bezos, I'm not so sure about, but I think you're exactly right. Rules, to quote you, are in the service of scale and efficiency, and but the opposite's not true. Anarchy is not in the service of innovation, but the willingness to question rules and to reason from first principles is in the service of innovation. So let me go to my next slide. I'm going to jump to reasoning from first principles, not simple rules, is critical for high-level dynamic capabilities. So what's reasoning from first principles? That is throwing the rule book out and break down a complicated problem into its basic elements and then reason from the ground up. And of course, you know, this is what Aristotle taught his students. And, you know, you can find a lot that Elon Musk says and Charlie Munger says, which is exactly along these lines. And here's a quote from Aristotle: in every systematic inquiry where there are first principles or causes or elements, knowledge results from arguing knowledge of these. So figure out the underlying elements and then argue about them and find new combinations. And with my Musk quote, here's my Elon Musk quote: people's thinking processes is too bound by analogy to prior experience. You have to build reasoning from the ground up, from first principles. I think he's saying something diametrically different from what Kathy Eisenhardt is saying, and we'll find out on Thursday what she does with this reasoning from first principles. So I want to juxtapose these two alternatives: simple rules versus reasoning from first principles. And I think if you're doing something that's radically different, the answer has to be reasoning from first principles. If you're doing something that's more or less the same, then maybe you can follow rules. You know, it's down to this distinction that we already talked about between the cook and the chef. A cook follows a rule book. A chef does not. The chef tries different things and new combinations, is constantly innovating. Cooks don't innovate, or if they do, they usually mess it up. I'm very skeptical of this simple rules idea, except, and let's come back to where we were, for low-level dynamic capabilities. What are low-level dynamic capabilities? Incremental innovation, maybe. So, you know, we had ordinary capabilities and dynamic capabilities, but if you make a finer gradation down to low level and higher level, maybe there's room for the Stanford perspective, I'll call it here, versus the Berkeley perspective. It fits rather well because the Stanford people are more rule-driven. At Berkeley, we're chaotic always. So the Berkeley position is more consistent with creating higher level dynamic capabilities. No wonder why a lot of entrepreneurs, like to sort of hang out in the Berkeley environment. So appreciate your views there. Let's see, others have got something to say too. Design thinking as a framework and approach innovation can help dynamism. Okay, so help me out here. Is design thinking rule-based or not? Are there rules for design thinking? Andrew, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. My apologies on that, having some issues here. That's I guess a question I would have for you is in my opinion, there's maybe a difference between types of rules, and it's prescriptive rather than descriptive. And my impression of design thinking is it was a framework of rules. I think building on Musk's analogy of a chef versus a cook, you would watch, let's say, the Chef's Table on Netflix, and you would get a lot of this. There is a sense of thinking about the flavor palette and thinking about the chef's personal experience and history of where they're cooking, and there is a pattern through which they'll follow a framework, and they'll say, I'm curious about introducing these flavors here. And I think that these flavors complement one another. And therefore, I would, experiment and explore with different things. And so that's kind of where I'm finding a challenge personally, is differentiating between the two types of rules that may or may not imply.
Yeah, so maybe you're suggesting that there are sort of a higher level of rules that are quite general. They're not highly specific rules. They're very general rules that even a chef might use. Like, I discovered, every chef I'm sure knows this, but if you oversalt something, you can sort of fix it with sugar or whatever it is. So there's certain foods that are natural complements. And you can't define it, you can't write it down. In fact, it's kind of tacit. I mean, a chemist could probably write it down, but a wonderful chef will know what those sort of macro level principles are. But I don't think a principle is the same thing as a rule. And first principles is not first rules. It's just a method of engagement. It's more a methodology for discovery than it is a map for action. Anyway, very good observations there, Andrew. See if we have others saying something.
Beto, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, chefs learn when and how to ignore certain rules of cooking to create an innovative experience. Yes, so it's knowing when to bust the rules. That's where innovation comes from. Sorry, we had an audio question in. Is that right?
Yeah, and
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just on the topic of sort of design thinking and dynamic capabilities, it's design thinking itself. If you take all of the tools in that toolbox and apply it wholesale, then it becomes a process and it becomes very rigid and not dynamic at all. So it really does kind of fall on, who's wielding those tools, because they'll be able to kind of change based on the situation what design thinking elements would be most applicable to a particular situation. So I'm a design lead at Netflix, and I've been there for a few years, and design thinking at Netflix tends to happen a little bit differently than in my experience at other companies, where it's usually a rigid process. They put the designer in that process, and then you get some kind of product at the end of it. It's a little bit different at Netflix and more dynamic. It's more flexible, and it can adapt to different situations and different projects based on all of the components and all of the people involved.
So you're saying there are rules at Netflix, or did you say rules or tools? And when does a rule become a tool, and when is it different from a principle?
Yeah, one of the things that we do as designers is come up with principles when there's a really big ambiguous problem. Instead of trying to come up with a process to be able to solve a problem, if it's ambiguous, you can't develop a process to solve that problem. But instead, you can come up with a set of principles. And to frame those principles as evolving as well, things that these principles can change over time based on the situation if they need to.
And do these principles get articulated and written down, or are they sort of just in the air? They get written down.
Yeah.
And is this by project managers or by more senior people? Who is it that's writing them down? And is there some big Netflix book of rules, or is it just very, they change month by month or quarter by quarter or day by day?
Yeah, it depends on the team. So there's the culture memo that's pretty famous in Silicon Valley, and that's really for how the whole company as a whole operates, which is very light on rules in general, but really focuses more on values rather than rules. But individual teams will come up with principles as well for their specific areas. And this varies team by team, and every team calls it something different. So it's a little bit chaotic, probably looking from the outside, but for the people that are in it, as long as things are framed well, which kind of raises my question of, would framing be one of the dynamic capabilities that someone would need to have in order to effectively transform a company, the ability to frame things within a certain context or situation?
Well, the sensing and sense making. Sense making is really about framing, because you see all of this information out there, and you have to frame it in some way to exclude that which is irrelevant and focus on that which is relevant. But from what I hear you say, the rules at Netflix are not rigid, they're very flexible, and that they actually might even vary sort of project by project and group by group or something like that. It's not all coming down from Reed Hastings or anything like that. It's percolating up from the bottom, if anything. Is that fair? Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
All right. Well, right. So then it's not simple rules. It's maybe I'm having trouble with the word simple. Simple rule does not describe Netflix. Then it's sort of temporary rules that are help frame particular problems, and they get modified and adapted as needed for changing circumstances, something like that. All right. I appreciate that insight. Thank you.
And there's actually a couple raised hands, so John and then Lamont.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question, Professor. Going back to the first principles versus rules discussion, the reasoning from first principles makes a lot of sense. It kind of reminds me like David Deutsch framework with rules being all background knowledge, and you have to reason to get explanatory knowledge. So that makes a lot of sense. I guess my question's a dumb one though. Like, how do you get good at that? Where do you develop that skill, and how do you craft that and refine it?
Well, I think the first thing you do is sort of recognize that when there's a lot of complexity, you've got to distill it. I mean, yeah, no, you raise a very good question. How do you operationalize all of this? Well, being sensitive to what's important in managing in these environments is step one. And how do you get good at it? Well, you live at it, you look at it, and you've got to have something in the back of your mind that helps you understand what people are doing that works and helps you critique when they're not doing things that work. I know there's not a very good answer, but you asked a very hard question. It's tantamount to asking how do you operationalize something like dynamic capabilities, and I don't think it's ever going to be operationalized. That's why the simple rules thing is a fool's errand. A fool's errand is something that you can never achieve, right? So, but striving to achieve it every day, as we just heard with Netflix, does help you frame problems. You just have to constantly be reframing them as the circumstances change. But you have periods of stability in every environment, no matter how turbulent it is. Like just take COVID. I mean, at first there's a shitload more uncertainty, like March, April, May, if you're a manager, you didn't know what the hell was going on. And, now we're still in COVID, but there's more predictability. You can have certain rules for running the company. So this is the notion of punctuated equilibrium. Remember, I think in the very first class, I talked about the sort of Schumpeterian waves of change. It's even though people like to say that this change is happening all the time, there are periods of relative stability, and so you can have these rules that sort of work for a while, but as soon as the environment changes, you better be ready to change the rules. It's a very oblique answer to your question, because your question was, well, how do you learn to do that? I think most of it's experiential, but I hope you'll tell me at the end of the class that having a conceptual framework was of some use, but maybe you won't. We'll see. Maybe I'll ask you 5 years later if I bump into you somewhere at Starbucks, whether it was a drop of good or not. I know it helps me. It helps me, I develop all of this stuff basically to help me run organizations that I create, because there aren't any textbooks. And this is close to describing the reality that I live in highly competitive environments as I can think of. So even if nobody else gets any benefit from it, I get personal benefit from it. That said, the fact that so many other scholars have latched onto this says there's something here. I feel like the blind man, the man with one eye with blind men, that dynamic capabilities gives you some ability to see forward and to understand the world as it is, but not very much.
Professor Teece, I had a point. If you think about some companies who play by simple rules, such as working back from a customer, they have performed really well in the VUCA environment. I take an example of Salesforce. They are very customer focused. In a VUCA environment, they saw COVID as an opportunity to help their customers, be it with vaccine rollouts or what have you. And they came up with innovative ideas on that same principle. And build products, developed products, were innovative and were largely successful at it. What would you say about that? Is that not an example of somebody following simple rules and still being being innovative?
Okay, so you started by saying with COVID they came up with a whole bunch of new ways.
I just took an example. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, so the first point you made is that whatever rules there were before, there was a set of new rules with COVID. So, but it helpful. Yeah, I think there are rules of thumb. Look, when there's humans cannot understand everything. We have to simplify. Go back to Einstein's original statement. You simplify as much as possible, but you don't oversimplify, no more than you naturally can. And distilling complexity down in some fashion to rules or modes of thinking or ways of acting is important. And but I think if you're really doing radical, I mean, that, you know, COVID is an example of being reactive. Environment changes. How do I change something that's already pretty well structured, which is my interaction with the customer? But suppose Salesforce set itself a new goal of, you know, how am I going to help people sell in completely new and different ways? It's something radical. Then it's, and this is, I think, Musk's point. There's no, when you truly are a pioneer, no one's leaving you tracing for how to do things. You've got to navigate that all anew, and the rule book it doesn't work. I mean, it's the same thing. If you take a map, well, actually, you know, if you parachuted out of an airplane and you know, you're given the wrong map, you're probably not going to be helpful, but it nevertheless may tell you, oh, okay, you know, rivers tend to be at the bottom of gullies and things like that. There may be something from the old rules, from the old map, the irrelevant map that's useful, but a lot has to be reinvented. So I think the more radical the change, the less useful the rules, or the more radical revision to the rules. And then you're to the point of, well, is the rule, you know, do you have to think anew, or is it just a modification? So I think that's sort of the conundrum that we're up against here. So yes, coming back to what you were saying, that fits into what I call low-level dynamic capabilities. Simple rules do provide guidance through choppy seas with enough flexibility to respond to emergencies. But you're not doing anything really ambitious there. You're just serving customers a little better than yesterday.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Teece.
All right. Let's see. Patanjali says, oh no, Christian, reminds me of AGC case we did for today. Okay, that company seemed to have only very low dynamic capabilities. Well, we didn't get that done today, but hopefully we'll do it next time. Yeah, so the three Stanford cases by O'Reilly, I think, Ian, if I'm not mistaken, we'll have a chance to talk about those next week, so I'll put that to one side for the meantime. Any other verbal comments that anyone wants to make? I think we've probably got a few more slides we can go through here. So let's just move on. So let's think about strategy. Professor Eisenhardt says that you can use simple rules for strategy. Wow, I wish that were true. So let's just take the three components of strategy according to Ramel: diagnosis, guiding policy, coherent actions. Diagnosis, well, maybe there's ways of thinking in terms of diagnosis, but that's not very granular. Guiding policy, coherent actions. Yeah, I mean, there's always some kind of simple principle in there, but in terms of a well-articulated rule that can help you with strategy, there aren't any. Otherwise, a strategy textbook would be a very thin volume, wouldn't it? Everything is very context dependent. Now, the question is, Kathy Eisenhardt would say, well, she understands that. And so in any particular context, there are simple rules. For instance, create value, capture value, the principles more than rules. Navigate obstacles to progress. I mean, these are things you have to do, but there's no rules. How do you navigate obstacles to progress? If there are simple rules here, then we can use AI to do all of this for us, can't we? Even existing AI capabilities. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something and maybe I'm being unfair. So let me just go a little bit more into, well, what do we mean by reasoning by first principles? Explain the foundations of your thinking, examine consequences, challenge assumptions, look for evidence. It's why. Why? That's what reasoning from first principles is all about, and thinking everything from the beginning. And this is necessary when you're doing something original, dealing with complexity and managing what I call wicked problems. Wicked problems are very complicated problems. So my conclusion is that simple rules are not an Occam's razor. You know what Occam's razor is? Which is a shortcut basically for tech sector decision making. You still need dynamic capabilities. So that's my conclusion that I'll end up telling this webinar, that I wish simple rules worked. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for simple rules, but I think even if you did have simple rules, you still need dynamic capabilities and the ability to constantly reshape the rules. So that's where we're at. And as a setup for next week, I want to just let you peruse. I always say that teaching and my students help shape everything I know. And so over the years, as I've taught dynamic capabilities, I've refined this framework. And what I've got here, since you've got quite a lot of literature to read, on the right-hand side is my definitions of my terminology. And we've got ordinary capabilities, which we talked about in the first class. We've got now low-level dynamic capabilities and higher level or just straight dynamic capabilities. So actually just putting together this little talk for you today in the webinar, I've decided that it's helpful to have this low-level dynamic capabilities category out there to take account of a moderate change. Because when I think of the need for dynamic capabilities, I am thinking of Elon Musk, I'm thinking of Steve Jobs, I'm not thinking of General Electric running their automotive, their aircraft division, where you're constantly every year trying to squeeze a little bit of more thrust out of a jet. That's still innovation. Out of a fan jet, it's still innovation. You're getting a little more fuel efficiency, and that's sort of low-level dynamic capabilities. So these, I think, are useful distinctions. It's too, the 0-1 is off on is too sharp a distinction. And anyway, what I'm teaching you is in the far right column, but as you read Professor Eisenhardt's work, as you read Connie Helfat's work, as you read Sid Winter's work, you see they use these terms a little differently. So we don't have standardization in this literature yet. Hopefully, eventually, one day we will. But for the meantime, we don't. So you can use this little table as you're reading, and different authors are using these terms somewhat differently, which makes it awfully hard for you and for me too, for that matter. Okay, well, look, we're out of time. I appreciate your attention today. I can tell that we're making some good progress here. You folks really, through your responses to written questions and through the questions you're putting to me today, are really grappling with these issues in the way I want you to. So I'm more than happy to engage with you one-on-one. And by the way, in the second half of the class, that will be, I will try to do that more and more. I'm really eager to meet all of you. I don't know how many of you are in the Bay Area, by the way, versus somewhere else. Because okay, we got a few, but I'm going to be vaccinated here within a little while, and
I want the world to move back to normal as fast as possible, and so we can have socially distanced one-on-one or multiple meetings outside or what have you. Let's not be trapped inside any longer than we need to. I've got a big sailboat. If some of you want to come sailing with me, you're most welcome. Plenty of fresh air out there, and so long as you are careful, we can do this very safely. So look forward to arranging some meetings where we can discuss these concepts and bang heads together as we would in the classroom. So let's not let COVID diminish your educational experience and my delight in teaching you. And so we're looking forward to, for those of you in the area, to meeting you face to face, or at least having one-on-ones with some of you who may be outside the region. By the way, just a hands for how many people? I saw a few hands for who is in the East Bay or in the Bay Area. How many people are not in the Bay Area? Well, I'll let Ian figure that out, and in March, April time period, I'm looking forward to some close interaction with all of you. Okay, folks, have a good evening.